Our next speaker is Sarah Hart. The summer of 2006 was a formative season for Sarah. No longer satisfied to simply climb on the boulders below the Squamish Chief, she decided she was going to learn the art of traditional climbing and take that skill into the mountains. In just a few short months, Sarah learned a skill that takes most climbers years to develop. Fearless and never lacking confidence, she eagerly committed to an all-female climbing expedition to the Himalaya. What she didn't already know about climbing in the mountains, she figured she'd figure out on the way, or so she thought. On an Alpine climbing trip at the end of that summer, Sarah took an unroped crevasse fall. In the months following, she learned just how fragile her confidence was and how little respect she'd had for the fear that keeps us safe in the mountains. Everyone, Sarah Hart.
Thank you. All right, I'm in the box. Time's starting. This is me. I just taken a giant whipper. I fell 30 meters down a steep slope of snow. I had a 20-kilogram backpack on at the time, and it flipped me upside down, so I fell head first. And at the bottom of that 30-meter slope of snow was a 5-meter moat, which is where the glacier starts to separate from a rock buttress. So as my partners came upon me, it became apparent that I wasn't going to be getting myself off the glacier by my own strength, and that we were going to have to call for help. So a satellite phone call, and 4 hours later, a search and rescue helicopter arrived to pluck myself and my partners off the glacier, deliver us to the hospital. And I broke my arm. I had several very deep gashes, and there were some fears of spinal injuries. But it wasn't until a few months later that it became apparent that the worst injury I had was actually something entirely different. I was incapacitated with fear, and as you've now heard from Kevin, I was rather fearless just a few months prior to that. I had decided that I was going to become a crack climbing whiz, and I was going to climb hard mountains. So in the span of just a couple months, I went from being a boulder and a sport climber to being a crack climbing master. It's a skill that typically takes people years to develop. And I was overly confident, definitely overly confident. But after my accident, my climbing became controlled by fear. I couldn't even get up a 5/8 without having a full meltdown. There was a lot of crying involved. And I've dealt with this fear ever since then. In fact, this photo was taken just 2 seasons ago in southern Patagonia on a climbing trip. And I had just come off climbing a route on Fitzroy, which is a very famous Patagonian peak, with my partner. It's the 1,300-meter North Ridge, and I ended up making one of the first female ascent of that route. So a few days later, we went back into the mountains to try something else, which was much smaller and much easier. But I couldn't even muster the courage to get off the ground, to get off the glacier. I couldn't even climb the 150 meters to the base of the rock climbing. I was absolutely incapacitated. So rewind a little bit, and the winter after my accident, I decided to exercise my demons by going on an all-female climbing expedition to the Himalayas. It didn't matter that myself and my 2 girlfriends had never, ever left the country on a climbing trip, or had never, ever been to something like the Himalaya. We decided to go for it anyways. So there we were, 3 25-year-old girls. We found ourselves on the Choctaw Glacier, and without communication to anybody. We did bring a sat phone, but as we turned it on the glacier, we realized that the sat phone doesn't work in Pakistan. So there we were, all alone. We ended up pulling it off. We climbed a new 900-meter rock route over 3 days. But the style I would describe our climbing was pure kamikaze style. We pretty much fell into success and avoided disaster by mere meters of a rope. And I felt lucky to have done it. We wanted it really bad, but it was what I would say was just blind confidence. Many years later, many years older, and many years wiser, I was in the mountains again with 2 girlfriends, this time to the Waddington Range of British Columbia. And we had decided to go and do a 2-week expedition and try and climb a couple of rock peaks. And it turns out that being much wiser and being much older goes really well for your climbing objectives. And myself and my 2 girlfriends, we worked really well together as a team, and we're not afraid to admit that we were terrified or to stop in our tracks and say, wait a second, we need to talk about this. And we shed a lot of tears, and it was okay. And so the sort of best part of our trip was climbing the 1,600-meter south ridge of a mountain called Sarah 2. And we climbed day 1. We planned to bivvy halfway through. We climbed day 1 and noticed that the weather was sort of turning for the worse, but we really wanted it still. And we had discussed, and we felt like we could make it happen. But we woke up from our bivvy the next morning, and the mountain was covered in snow. The weather had definitely crapped out on us. And so it was time for us to put our heads together and to acknowledge our fears, but also figure out how we could move past our fears and successfully get ourselves up the mountain. We ended up doing it. We did a lot of navigating in whiteouts, and there was, again, more crying, but always in control. And I think it's kind of a girl thing to cry when you're scared. But we ended up pulling it off, and it was an incredibly satisfying experience to feel like we could acknowledge that we were afraid. We could cry, but at the same time, we could really go hard. And every time somebody got tired, another of us would take the lead and lead through the rime-covered ridge line to the summit. And it was pretty awesome to rappel back down onto the glacier just as darkness was falling, and realizing that we had achieved what we hoped to, and we had done so in a clean and a good style. Everybody was safe. So the moral of the story, I have a few lessons. The first is choosing your partners wisely. It doesn't matter whether you're climbing or whether you're going on a mountain bike ride or whatever. But for me, success comes with climbing with other women, because, like I said, I like to cry, and crying in front of a group of guys doesn't always go so well. The other is that sometimes fear is actually irrational. I mean, maybe when you're halfway up a mountain and all you can think about is that your rope is going to snap in half just by some random chance, that might be slightly irrational. The other thing that I've learned is that being confident doesn't necessarily mean that you're ignoring the risks. I think that part of being a good climber, part of doing anything really well, is being able to be confident, but at the same time acknowledge what the hazards are, acknowledge where the dangers exist, and being able to move confidently past those. And then the last is that, sometimes your fears are actually there for a reason, and sometimes it's okay to say that you're scared and to turn around and not do it. So I have an intense fear of snow now, obviously, and this photo is actually taken at one of those perfect examples where I said, I'm actually not okay with this. We're going to stop. So yeah, I guess the moral of the story is that when you manage to combine fear and respect and confidence in the mountains, some pretty rad things can actually happen, and you might surprise yourself with what you can succeed. Thank you. Thank you. Oh.
Actually, guys cry too, I'll note. Dennis can attribute to that. Doug Copeland said, actually, adventure without risk is Disneyland. And I think that, there's profound meaning in the risk, I suspect. And, what advice would you give to someone who's sort of contemplating a risky sports, maybe alpine climbing or another risky sport? They love the idea of it, but what would be your advice to them?
Well, I think by my own firsthand experience, I think learning whatever you're going to involve yourself in really well is important. Don't just go and try and be kamikaze like I did. The only reason that I'm here today is because I got very lucky. But I think taking the time to really understand what you want to do, know how to do it well and efficiently is really important. And at the same time, too, I think that acknowledging that when fear is irrational and when fear is valid and that you need to listen to that, those are really important things. I think intuition actually comes into play when you're climbing a lot, and being able to listen to that and respond to that is important. There are a lot of people that well, and I've been one of them, that have been able to get by simply by just ignoring the risks, not listening to that sort of inside voice saying, this is totally sketchy. And they've only gotten by just by pure luck. But the people that are calculated and that understand the risk factors and understand what's going on around them and acknowledge the risks and at the same time are able to move confidently past that are the ones that really succeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah Hart, everyone.